bonsoir et bienvenue. C'est un très grand plaisir et aussi un moment assez émotionnel d'être là avec vous, avec mes collègues de la Faculté de psychologie et des sciences de l'éducation, de pouvoir accueillir Susan Goldin-Meadow. Alors Susan, c'est toute une histoire, mais il va falloir que maintenant je passe en anglais. Donc, ceux d'entre vous qui ont la traduction, allez-y. So, Susan is not just an esteemed colleague. Yes, she is a Beardsley Russell Distinguished Service Professor, a mouthful at the University of Chicago. She holds an appointment not only in psychology, but also in education. She's also a mentor. Like when I was a young postdoc, I was working on deafness and cross-modal plasticity, and the papers of Susan were always like interesting in all these different weird, innovative ways. And a friend. We learned to use our hands, not so much for thinking, but for drinking wine, caipirinhas, and many different things. But no, in truth, actually, one of the rare characteristics that Susan brings to academia is to both be immensely innovative and of an extreme experimental rigor. And this is really this kind of vision that has led her to receive many, many different prizes. And more recently, she was awarded, for example, the Rumelhart Prize for the contribution to the theoretical foundation of cognition in 2021. In 2022, only very recently, she was also induced in the prestigious National Academy of Science in the US. And she really says she owes her vision to one critical year she spent in Geneva. Just to give you an idea of how much imagination and creativity Susan can bring to her, she told me that the first day of her stay, she was a student exchange with Smith College in 1969, if I'm not mistaken, and she was staying with the Faculty of Psychology, Piaget and his team in Helder and Sinclair, and she had a class she wanted to see that was a Piaget class. She arrives in one of these rooms, probably not very different from the one we are here today, and sat at the back of the class. Her French was a little bit rusty, if not non-existent. She was with a friend, and I think it took them about 15 minutes to realize that they were not in a class of Piaget, but in a physics class. But for the good 15 minutes, they entertained the possibility that they were actually being taught about, like, you know, some fundamental of how, like, you manipulate objects when you're children. This was physics, after all, like, you know, it was close to Piaget's heart. And went with it as true believers. But this is really a landmark feature of Susan's spirit and really contribution to science. And I'm not going to take the floor more because I really want you to hear from her, and I'm delighted you're here today for us.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Daphne. I appreciate it. Are we on? Aha, as Daphne said, where can I stand? Okay, because I want to look at this too. Okay, as Daphne said, I spent my junior year abroad from Smith College, 1969-70, in Geneva. And we took courses in the Palais Wilson, which was the old League of Nations building. That's where the Piagetian Institute, the Institute of Sciences of Education, were at the time. I took courses with Piaget and courses with Inhelder. I did research with Mimi Sinclair, who was the person who was most interested in language at the time. And I worked with Annette Karmeloff, That's me. That's Annette in 1969-70. At that time, she and I have written a paper. Neither one of us had our hyphens at that point, because she became Annette Karmeloff-Smith, and I became Susan Goldin-Meadow. But we did write this paper in the archives, which is without hyphens. So what was really interesting to me, this year was pivotal. This year, as Daphne said, it really changed the nature of my career. I had a career. Before I came, I didn't have a career, and after, I did have a career. What intrigued me was Piaget's focus on development and origins. I was really excited about it, and I wanted to know where language came from and what it has to do with thought. So many people believe that language is essential to thought. The really extreme view is that you can't think unless you have language. So this extreme view is wrong. It's wrong on many, many counts. And actually, Piaget came up with some of the most convincing accounts of why this view is wrong. What I'd like to do today is to give you another argument against the view that thinking requires language. So what I'm going to talk about today, at least for part of today, is that children who aren't exposed to language can invent one. And they use their hands to do it. So their minds are shaping language rather than the other way around. They obviously don't need language to think because they're thinking and then creating language. So the first part of my work and my talk will focus on the mind that's hidden in our hands, creating language. Okay. But most of us do have language that we've learned. So what do we do with our hands? So we obviously, as you all know, we move them. We gesture when we talk. And those gestures, what you may not know, is that those gestures reveal our thoughts. And there may be thoughts that you don't even know you have. So what I want to do in the second part, what I did in the second part of my work, and I'm going to do in the second part of this talk, is to focus on the mind hidden in hands accompanying language. Okay, so let's start by thinking about the mind hidden in hands that are creating language. So I'm contrasting here creating language versus just accompanying language. Okay, so to do this, I want you to imagine a far-fetched scenario. This is not likely to happen, but I think it's worth thinking about. Okay, so all languages, be they spoken, signed, written, disappear. Gone, absolutely gone. But everything else about us, all of culture, remains the same. So think about that for a minute. Now, the question is, would we expect language to reemerge under these conditions? So, if language looks the way it does, because it has been handed down from generation to generation to generation to generation, it might not reemerge. Why should it? There's no starting point. On the other hand, if language is the way it is because it reflects the structure of our minds or how we as humans want to communicate, language might reemerge, and it might also have the properties of our current day languages. So there are very different predictions here as a function of whether you think language is just accumulation of years of language change, or whether language can in part come from us. Okay, so in a sense, what I'm trying to ask is about the resilience of language. Was it a one-time invention? Or is it a system that can be invented de novo, over and over again, by children? Okay, now the first study to really be described in the literature was described by Herodotus in 429 BC. Herodotus is an ancient Greek philosopher who tells us about two kings who were having an argument over which was the original language. And the two candidates, it's an Egyptian king and a Phrygian king. And perhaps not surprisingly, the only candidate languages they considered were Egyptian and Phrygian. But what is a little bit more unusual is they decided not to solve this argument by fighting. They decided to do it by experiment. So what they did is they put two children, freshly born children, in the custody of a shepherd, told the shepherd to go out into the hills, make sure the kids were fed and watered and treated nicely, but never to talk to them. Don't say a word. There they sat for 18 months. Kings came back at around 18 months to 2 years to see what happened. And what happened is that both children produced the word bakos, which means bread in Phrygian. And there the matter has rested for many, many years. Phrygian is the natural language. Now, this is a tough, even before IRB's, protection for human subjects got serious, this was a tough study to replicate, okay? We really can't do it. But we can't deprive children of language. We don't like doing that. Even psychologists don't like doing that. But we can take advantage of an experiment of nature where children just happen to be deprived of usable linguistic input. So these are children who, by circumstances, don't have linguistic input. And then the question is, can such a child reinvent language? So the hard question is, who doesn't have language? Almost everybody has language. Well, there are some children, young children, whose hearing losses prevent them from learning a spoken language, and who are born to hearing parents. And their hearing parents don't know sign language and haven't exposed their children to sign language. So they can't learn spoken language, they haven't seen sign language, so what happens? They might do nothing and just sit in the corner and never talk or communicate with anybody, but in fact they do communicate with their parents and siblings, and they use their hands to do so. And these gestures are called home signs, and the kids are called home signers. Okay, I want to give you an example of what a home signer looks like. So this is a deaf child born to hearing parents in the United States. He's looking at a picture book. It's Richard Scarry picture book, for those of you who know the literature. There's a picture of a shovel. It's a sand shovel stuck in sand. And what he does first is he points at the shovel, then he does a little shoveling gesture, and then he sort of goes off on a tangent and says you can use this when you pull on your boots and when it snows and the shovel's kept used outside and kept downstairs. And he starts to tell us a little story about snow shovels from this picture. Okay.
Shovel, shovel.
In the winter time.
Oh, yeah, that's a good
Shovel in the winter time. Yeah.
Outside?
And it's snowing.
Oh, and it's snowing. Oh, you got a shovel.
Snowing.
Right. Oh, I see. Where's the shovel?
Where is it? It's in the garage.
There it is.
There.
Downstairs. Oh, there's the shovel. Oh, big.
I do have to apologize for these videotapes. They were taken in 1972, so they're a little grainy on a reel-to-reel videotape. It's the best I can do here. So after we found these kids, this is Heidi Feldman, with whom I began this work, and Lila Gleitman. After we found these kids, we tried to describe the properties. It was clear the kids are communicating. But the question is, are they using language to communicate? So we started to look at these children, and we expected that they might be structuring their communications. We didn't expect them to structure it all in the same way. But it turned out, we studied 6 children in Chicago and 4 in Philadelphia, and they all used pretty much the same structure. Not the same signs, but the same structure. So we thought, where's the structure coming from? Maybe it's coming from the American culture in a way that we just can't even see. So we started to go out and study deaf children of hearing parents in another culture. And we found home signers in Taiwan, and let me give you an example of a home signer in Taiwan. I have to give you some backstory here. This is a little child, she's looking at the same book, but she's picked out a picture of a swordfish. It's actually a pretty friendly swordfish, but what she says is the swordfish can pierce you through the heart and make you dead. This turns out to be it's a gesture. It's not a sign in sign language. It's a gesture that Taiwanese hearing people use, and it means dead. She says it swims through the water, and it has a long nose. And just to show you that this is a language that she uses with the hearing people in her world, her little hearing sister comes in front of her, sits down, and the little girl tells his sister that it can pierce her through the heart and make her dead as well.
我铅笔给他，他喜欢写字，跟玩具有关。哦，他死掉啦！真的啊？死掉啊？哦，真的啊？鱼刺。他说的是一个大的，不晓得什么鱼。这个。他说他鼻子尖尖的，妈妈死掉了，已经。
The piercing through the heart was probably a little harder than it needed to be symbolic, but it is what it is. So what we found actually is that these Chinese children created structures very much like the American home signers, which is very interesting. And it suggests there's something about really our minds that are shaping this communication. So what we found is what we've called the resilient properties of language. We found structure in each one of these children's systems at the word level, at the sentence level, and in terms of language use. And what I want to do is just give you one example of each. Okay? So at the sentence level, what we found, at the word level, what we found is that they can invent lexical items to refer to objects, actions, attributes. Here's an example of the deaf child in America using eat, a gesture for eat. Okay, that's not a surprise. That's what you would do too. But here's a child in Taiwan who also uses this to mean eat, but he uses another gesture that's quite specific to his culture, and he does this, okay? Okay, so these kids are inventing these signs that they then incorporate into sentences. So what's interesting about the sentences is that they're ordered. I mean, they don't have to be ordered. This is a child who is actually inviting me to have a snack. So he points up at the snack that his mother's brought in, does an action, and then points at me. Okay, I'll show you that first. Grapes, eat you. Okay, actually he's holding a toy. Doesn't matter. He just makes the eat gesture nonetheless. It's as though, sort of gesturing it's a little like having food in your mouth when you're talking. You don't get rid of the food or the gum, you just gesture, okay? And this order, grape, eat, you, is different from English. In English, we would say you eat the grape. But he says grape, eat, you. And it's very clear. And he does it not only in this sentence, but in all of his sentences. Objects of actions come first, and then come actions. And then later, for this child, agents come after that. There's no need to have this order. It's pretty clear I'm going to be doing the eating, not the grape. So it's not really needed to communicate his message. Nonetheless, he uses a structured order. And this is an example of language use. So if you were all by yourself, I don't know if you'd invent a gesture language. You might not. You might really need somebody else to talk to. But once you've invented it to talk to somebody else, you actually use it to talk to yourself. So this is an example where the two kids are sitting there. He's a deaf kid and his hearing sister. They're playing side by side with clay. He gets up, he's looking for a plastic knife. And what he does is he does gestures where, and then he points at himself. Where's my knife? But I'm doing it in a different way from the way he did it. He doesn't look at anybody. He's looking down. Okay, so watch him. His eyes are looking, they're looking for the knife. He is not talking to anybody other than himself. Okay, and if I were to hand him a knife at that point, he wanted to find it himself. This was really conversation for himself. Okay, now one question, something that may be bothering you, it bothered us, was whether these linguistic properties were they invented by the children themselves? These are deaf children of hearing parents. And of course, hearing people gesture all the time. Maybe the children learn their properties from their hearing parents' gestures. Okay? And then, if that's the case, then it's the children, it's the parents who are inventing the system, not the children. Okay, so what we did to discover this, or to answer this question, is we looked at the structural properties of the gestures that the hearing parents produced when they interacted with their children. So they're talking, but they're also gesturing. And we analyzed the parents' gestures in the same way that we analyzed the deaf children's gestures. And we looked at a particular construction, a complex noun phrase. And this is when two different gestures refer to the same object. Let me give you an example. So we also studied deaf children and hearing parents in Nicaragua, and I'll come back to this. This is a Nicaraguan home signer who's producing a complex noun phrase. What he's doing is he's producing a sign for airplane, then he points at himself. Airplane self is over there. It's my airplane that's over there. Two gestures to talk about my airplane. Airplane mine, it's over there. Okay, and this is the structure. It's a very simple structure, but it is structured, and there's hierarchy here, because my airplane is embedded underneath a sentence clause. Okay, so do hearing parents do this? Do they produce this with their gestures? Well, as it turns out, we looked at all the gestures that these hearing parents produced, and we analyzed them with the same tools. And what we found is that the hearing parents don't do this very much. So what you see here is the number of times, or the proportion of times, that the home signers in red and their hearing parents in blue produce a complex noun phrase, an example I just showed you. Okay? As you can see, in Nicaragua, the children do it much more than their parents. In the United States, the parents don't ever do it. So they never point at an apple and do eat to mean, that's an apple, give it to me. They never do it. But in Nicaragua, there's a fair amount of variability. So maybe the parents who do it a lot have kids who do it a lot, and the parents who do it a little have kids who do it a little, in which case we'd find a relationship between parent and child. So we looked at that next, and we found absolutely no relationship between the two. So what you have here is the proportion of complex sentences that the hearing family members produced. And on the y-axis, we have the proportion that the children produce. And what you can see is that, as I showed you before, the mothers are all 0 for the United States. All those circles are right there. And the kids go, some do a little, some do a lot. But interestingly, for the Nicaraguan guys, the mother who does the most has a kid who never does it. So it just doesn't look like the kids are learning these structures from the parents, particularly since this is a structure they come up with on their own. Okay, so home signers, what we concluded from this is that home signers can invent the rudiments of language. But one question is, how far can they go? They're kids, so they may not be able to go so far. They're also on their own. They're only using these gestures with their hearing parents. How far can they go? Maybe some aspects of language, remember I talked at the beginning that some aspects of language might need to be carried down, transmitted from one generation to the next in order to exist. Those properties of language shouldn't be invented by these home signing children. So we can look at the home signers and what happens after them to address this question. Because it turns out that sign languages grow out of home sign. That's where all sign languages come from, for the most part. And right now in Nicaragua, a sign language is growing up out of home sign. It started 40 years ago when home signers were all brought together. These are home signers who talked only to their hearing parents or their hearing siblings. I've represented them by being little eggs unto themselves because they only talk to hearing people. And they gesture home sign, but what they get back is co-speech gesture, the gestures that parents produce, which look different from what they're producing. They produce one thing and get something out back. But 40 years ago, these children, or adolescents at that point, were all brought together at a time, and they were put in a school that was teaching them Spanish, which they couldn't learn, but it put them all in the same place where now they could produce home sign and see somebody else produce home sign. So there's both a give and a take between this. And the question is, does the language change? And finally, there's a third step that's going on because all of these this language that is growing up is now being taught to young deaf children who come into the situation. So they are learning the language, and as it turns out, they change the language in the learning. So what we have here is 3 different situations of creation. This is creation by individuals, creation through communication, and creation through learning over generations. Okay. So what I want to do is just very quickly give you an example of a property, the plural, which is generalized only in cohort 2, that is through learning, and it's when language is learned. So this isn't something that home signers do. It's only there several generations later. So home signers can't do everything. Okay, so if I asked you to indicate more than one thing, if there were a whole bunch of cups in a row, you'd indicate it doing this. Just like this guy, he's a home signer in Nicaragua. Boom, 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 boom. Okay. But there are other ways to do it. Actually, he's not a home signer, he's a first generation. Okay, you can do it this way, showing bup, bup, bup. And when you do bup, 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 you do bup, 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 bup for, it doesn't matter how many things. I could do bup, 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 bup for 5 things, for 3 things, for 2 things, for 1 thing. For more than 1 thing. It's got to be more than 1, but it doesn't matter how many. It looks much more like a bunch, a plural marker. Just like that, okay. So we asked whether the conditions under which people would, these Nicaraguan cohorts, would use their gestures to represent this situation where somebody's putting down a bunch of pens. Okay. And what we found is that home signers use this discrete form, bump, 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 when they're representing this situation, but not the plural. Now, maybe when you bring them all together, this plural would erupt and that would be developed. But in fact, that's not true. The first cohort, those guys who came together and learned by sharing, it didn't help the plural. The plural came about only when there was learning. So this way of looking at this situation is a way of looking at properties of language that come together, that we develop as humans, and properties of language that we need transmission, learning, in order to develop. Okay, so it's only when home sign is transmitted to the next generation, when it's learned, that this plural marker is used in the agent context. So to summarize this part of my research and this part of the talk, the mind hidden in hands creating language. Home sign gives us a window onto the properties of language that are so resilient they can be invented by a child. Over and over again, children can invent these properties. These are fundamental properties of mind that give shape to language, not the other way around. But this emergence of Nicaraguan sign language, and any other sign language actually, from home sign can tell us about the factors that are important that shape our language as it lives today. The factors that, like learning, that really shape our current day languages. So we have an answer to the question. We can look at both sides of this. Okay, so growing beyond the resilient properties of language. Okay, one final point before I move on to the second half. Language is resilient. Are other skills equally resilient? We looked at home signers' understanding of number, because number feels like a robust property of humans. Counting happens in most cultures, if not all. So we gave the home signers a videotape that sort of involved numbers of things. So this is sheep, and a bunch of them leave the pen. Here they go. Here's first 1, and then 4. And all we did was we said to the home signers, okay, can you please describe this for us? Okay, so here's the description, and it's pretty good. I think it's really a pretty good description. So what we were interested in is when they do this, or when they hold up their fingers, are they holding up the right number? Are they holding up the wrong number? Okay, so this is, we knew how many sheep there were. We put them there. So this is the number of sheep that there were. This is the number of fingers that they held up. And as you can see, when the numbers get large, the home signers get approximate. they're not bad. You know, if it's 6, they'll do 5, 6, 7. But when the numbers are small, 1, 2, 3, 4, they are absolutely perfect. Now you might say, well, I might do that too, because it's hard to count a lot of things. But if I give you an infinite amount of time, take an unlimited amount of time and do this, you'll do it right. So the home signers, given an unlimited amount of time, still look like this. But the unschooled hearing controls in Nicaragua are quite perfect. They have large exact numbers. The signing deaf controls also have large, I mean, they're not perfect, but they're a whole lot better than the home signers. So it suggests that this having a large exact number is something that the home signers cannot do. And it also suggests that language may be more resilient than number, because kids can invent the fundamentals of language, but they may not be able to invent the fundamentals of number. Large exact number is really pretty important for our numerical system. Okay, so I've told you everything I know about the mind hidden in our hands that create language. Now let's think a little bit about the mind hidden in our hands that accompany language. Okay, so language is resilient. When it can't come out of the mouth, it comes out of the hands. What do the hands do when the mouth is used for language? Well, they gesture. Let me give you an example. All speakers gesture. Watch this person. She was just asked to say how you get from one place to another place.
Just tell me everything that will pass as we walk through.
Okay, well, the front door, there's an entryway, and so as soon as you enter the front door, you're going to see Dash's shoes on the right on the floor because they're dirty, and so I don't take them in. And he'll come in, and he'll bend down and pick them up, and I'll bring them to you, and he wags his tail. You wag your tail, he's so funny, and so.
Okay. There's nothing unusual about this woman's gestures, but there's something very unusual about her that some of you may have noticed. She's blind. And she is blind from birth. You can see her seeing eye dog right down there. But she's been blind from birth. She's never, ever seen anybody gesture. But when she talks, she gestures. It feels like hands and mouth are going together here. And once you start talking with your mouth, your hands are going to come up and move. But one question, of course, is what are these hands doing? Are they saying anything? Are they just hand-waving? And the answer is that gestures actually reflect what we know, and they can change what we know. And I'm going to give you some examples of each. Okay. So this study takes me back to Piaget. This is a Piagetian task of conservation. What Piaget did was he spread out 2 rows of checkers, asked the children if the 2 rows are the same, and the children said, yeah, of course they're the same number. And then he spread 1 row out and said, okay, are the 2 rows still the same number? And you'd say, of course they're the same number, you didn't do anything. And children above the age of 7 or 8 will also say that. But below the age of 7 or 8, they'll say, no, it's not the same. They're different. It's a different number. And when they say that, Piaget was very interested in the explanations they gave in their speech. But as it turns out, while they're talking and giving these explanations, they're also gesturing. So here's an example of a child who says they're different because you spreaded them out. And she says spreading out in her mouth, but she also does a spreading out gesture.
Like this. Do these 2 rows of checkers have the same number of checkers? No. Which row has more checkers in it? Now, why does that have more checkers in it?
You spread them apart and this one stay like you put them down.
Okay, so she is, in her speech, she's talking about spreading out, and in her gesture, she's talking about spreading out. Same information, not getting a whole lot of information from the gestures. But watch this next kid. He says exactly the same thing. He says, they're different because you moved them. Watch his hands. What he does with his hands is this. That's not how the checkers were moved. That, in fact, is pairing up the checkers in 1 row with the checkers in another row. It's one of those Piagetian explanations that sort of suggests conservation, 1-to-1 correspondence.
Do our rows have the same number of checkers in them now or different number? Why is there a different number in our rows?
Because you moved them.
Okay, so what this child has done is in his speech he's talking about moving, just like the other one, but in his gesture he's talking about one-to-one correspondence. That's pretty smart. His hands know a little bit more than his mouth does. So the question is that true? Is he maybe a little bit more open to instruction than the first child I showed you? So what we did was we gave them all instruction in conservation, and we looked to see what happened, who would improve and who wouldn't. And what I've shown you here, this is the proportion of children who improved after instruction. The guys in white are the ones who are matchers. Their speech and their gesture matched before instruction. The guys in blue are the ones whose speech and gesture didn't match before instruction. And what you can see is our guess was right. The kids who did mismatches before instruction were more open to instruction, and they were more likely to get better and profit from instruction. But maybe this is just about conservation, 5 to 8-year-olds. Is this a more general phenomenon? So we looked at math to see if we're true in math. Problem, 3 plus 4 plus 5 equals blank plus 5. Okay? As it turns out, 5th grade children in America have a little trouble with this problem. And when they have trouble with it, what they do is either they put 12 in the blank, so they've added up all the numbers on the left side of the problem, put that number in the blank, or they just add up all the numbers in the problem, and they put that number in the blank. But as we all know, I hope, the number is 7. You add up 3 and 4, and you put the 7 in the blank. Okay, so here's a child who says she added up all the numbers to the equal sign in both her mouth and her gestures. Oop, I missed it. Try it again.
How did you get 12 is your answer? I did 5 plus 4 plus 3.
Okay, she points at the 5 and the 4 and the 3. She says, I added. Okay, so she's in speech, add up to equal sign, in gesture, add up to equal sign. Now watch this one carefully. She says exactly the same thing. I added a 5 and a 4 and 3. But watch her hands, because the first thing she does is she points at the other 5, and then the 5 and the 4 and the 3. So she's talking about adding up all the numbers with her gestures.
So how did you get 12? I added 5.
You see it?
The 4 and then the 3 too.
All right.
Okay, so she's adding up to the equal sign in her mouth, but her gestures are adding up all of the numbers. So again, we thought, oh, maybe there's another one where the hands and the mouth are going in different directions. And we thought that maybe they might know a little bit more about math and therefore do better on instruction. So we instructed them all. None of them knew how to solve the problem. And this is the data I showed you before for conservation. This is the data for math. Again, the kids who were mismatchers prior to instruction got better, more better, than the kids who were matchers prior to instruction. So having gesture and speech that convey different information is good for learning. And notice here that this is really about the information gesture conveys. It's not gesturing or not gesturing, right? Because they're all gesturing. It's about the information conveyed in gesture and whether or not it matches the information conveyed in speech. Okay, so gesturing reflects what speakers know. I've just shown you that. Now, can it change what speakers know? Now, in order to really look at this, what we have to do is force children or people, encourage children, better said, encourage children to gesture in a particular way and see if that changes their thinking. Okay, so what we did is we manipulated the gestures that children produced during learning. We told one group of children to say, I want to make one side equal to the other side, which is the equalizer strategy. And they were supposed to say these words before and after solving every math problem. Here's an example.
I want to make one side equal to the other side.
Okay, now you put your answer in.
Okay, no gesturing. But this one was told to say exactly the same words, but she was told to put her 2 hands under the 2 numbers that were different and then point at the blank. Sort of a grouping strategy, add the 3 and 2. We didn't say this, we just gave her the movements.
So first of all, can you say the words and do the hand movements exactly like we practiced?
I want to make one side equal to the other side.
Okay,
So we forced her to make a mismatch, really, because she's talking about equalizer, but she's showing you how to actually solve the problem. And so what happens is that this is the mean number of problems solved correctly after instruction. They were all at 0 to start. These are the children who got speech alone. and these are the children who were forced to do speech plus gesture, they did better. They learned more when they themselves gestured, suggesting that the gesture is doing some work in changing their minds. Okay. Why does gesturing change our minds? It's not an answer I can give you, but I will give you some suggestions, some thoughts. Our thought was that gesture is grounded in action, but it also represents information. Right? So gestures are action. On the other hand, they represent things. If I do this to represent as a gesture for opening a jar, the jar isn't opening. But if I do this with an action, the jar will open. So gesture is borrowing action from real action on objects, but it's also being used to represent the information. Okay? And we thought it might have the potential to take a child, or anybody, an adult learner, from action, from real concrete manipulation, to a more abstract representation. Okay, so what we tried to do is we taught children the same words. I want to make one side equal to another side. That's our mantra here. And we gave them 3 different groups. Either they did action, they did concrete gesture, or they did abstract gesture. So here's a kid who did action. Pick up the 5, pick up the 7, put it in the blank. Okay, grouping. Concrete gesture did exactly the same thing, but without moving the numbers.
I want to make one side equal to the another side. Okay.
Okay, and here's the last one, abstract gesture. Pointed at the 2 numbers and then pointed at the blank.
I want one side equal to the other side.
Okay, so what happened? So they were all trained on these problems up there. 5 plus 7 plus 4 equals blank plus 4. And then they were tested first on problems that were exactly like that in format, just using different numbers. Okay? I'm going to show you kids in the action group, the concrete gesture group, and the abstract gesture. This is the proportion of children who succeeded in these 3 groups: action, concrete gesture, abstract gesture. There's no difference among them. You can learn to do the problem that you were taught, whether you're given action to do, concrete gesture to do, or abstract gesture to do. But we also gave them a few other problems that were a little more distanced from what they learned. So they're trained on that problem where the blank is right there, and they were tested on a problem where we switched the blank. You still add 2 numbers on that side and put it in the blank, but it's not the first 2 numbers. If you do the first 2 numbers, you're going to get it wrong. Okay, so this requires a little bit more understanding. It's not quite as rote as it would be as it was in the first set of problems that we showed you. So what happens? The interesting result is that the guys who were taught on action drop out. They can't generalize from that problem to this one, whereas the children who were taught using concrete gesture and abstract gesture can. The only difference is whether they picked up the objects and moved them. So what's going on here is that you can learn from all of these movements, but gesture really is helping children generalize the information they have to a known problem, which of course is what we want children to do when we teach them. Okay, so action helps children learn the problems on which they're taught, and gesture helps them extend that knowledge to new problems. Also, just for the record, gesture helps them remember longer. So if you teach them only with speech, they start to forget, whereas if you give them gesture, they keep going, which is another thing we want people to do when they're learning. Okay, so I've talked about the mind in hands creating language. I've talked about the mind hidden in hands accompanying language. Now here's just one last thing that I want you to think about. Do signers hide their minds in their hands? If so, they should gesture less, just like speakers do. And they do. Let me give you some examples. Okay. We asked speakers to describe objects that were really hard to describe distinguish in speech. I mean, these are 2 yellow vases, and it's hard to say what's different about the one on the right and the one on the left. So what happens when we ask speakers to do this is they start to gesture. So here's an example.
2 different humps in the middle and at the bottom.
Okay, so they start to gesture. When we ask signers to do this, these are signers of American Sign Language, they do the same thing. So here he goes. Okay, what's interesting about this also, I don't know if you noticed, but this guy not only does this with his hands, yeah, but he's doing it with his mouth as well, which no hearing person ever does. But here we go. I'll show you again. Come on. He does, I can't even do it. Okay, so they gesture not only with their hands, but with their mouths. Okay, so the question, though, is whether gesture has the same cognitive effects in signers and speakers. And answering this question actually gets at a really sticky little theoretical question that we wanted to answer. So, why does gesturing lead to change? There are two possibilities here. One is that gesture offers a second modality because you have your hand and you have your mouth, and two modalities are often better than one, and that might help you learn, might push learning forward. And the other possibility is gesture offers a second representational format because language is quite discrete. Gesture is a little more mimetic and pictorial. Maybe what's really good about having gesture and language together, spoken language, is that you have these two different representational formats. But this is a hard question to distinguish or to answer using hearing people. Because hearing people, when they gesture, they're always using their hands and their mouths and two different representational formats. But we can turn to signers to address this question. Because signers don't use two more modalities, they use only one, but they do use two representational formats. So their signs are discrete, categorical, just like spoken language, but their gestures are much more mimetic. Okay, so we asked two questions. Do signers produce gesture-sign mismatches? What even is a gesture-sign mismatch? And do those mismatches predict readiness to learn? So let me show you an example of a child who, we're going back to mathematical equivalence. This is a deaf child of deaf parents who has learned American Sign Language. She's answering this question, and she is not only signing, but she's also gesturing. She gestures the four numbers in the problem. So watch her. She says, okay, let me deconstruct that because it's fast. She signs add all, and she gestures by sweeping under the left side and then punking these four. Okay, so the gestures are pretty much, there are gestures there, and they're saying the same thing as the speech. They're matching, okay? Is that a lot or a little? I don't know, 80% of the kids did this. So we went back to our hearing kid data to try to figure out what they do and see if it's comparable. About 73% of the hearing kids do it, 80% of the deaf kids do it. Seems pretty comparable. Okay, now mismatches. This is much harder. But we did find things that we thought looked like mismatches. So here's a child answering the same problem, doing it wrong, saying I added up the numbers on this side and I put that number in the blank. But at the same time, she's got her hand over the 7. This is a gesture, sort of saying, ooh, I noticed that there are 2 7s here. I could wipe it out. So here she goes. Okay. So in sign, she's adding and putting. She doesn't add to equal sign. But in gesture, she indicates the 7, 4, and 2, but then she does this crossing out thing and covers the 7. So she has different information in her gesture and her sign. And this is clearly a gesture. Everybody agrees, which is nice. Okay, so the deaf children, 42% of children who produced greater than 3 mismatches for the deaf, and 35 do for the hearing. Okay, but that's not the crucial question. The crucial question is, does it predict learning? Okay, so this is the last thing I want to show you. What I did here is I divided the children before instruction into, according to how many mismatching sign and gesture they produced. None, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And what I'm going to do is look at, for each batch, look at how likely they were to profit from instruction. If you produce no mismatches, on hypothesis, they wouldn't do very well. But if you produce 6 mismatches, you should do great, and, you know, all the rest in between. And so what do we find? Exactly that. So children who produce no mismatches this is now sign gesture mismatches, prior to instruction, learned very little. The kids who produced 6 mismatches learned quite a lot. So what this suggests, and just to show you that this is quite comparable to what we found for the hearing kids, this is the data for the deaf kids in the same format that you saw the hearing kids. Okay. So it suggests that gesture-speech mismatch predicts learning as well as gesture sign mismatch predicts learning as well as gesture-speech mismatch does. So what that suggests is that it's really the putting together of 2 different representational formats. It doesn't matter whether it's hand and mouth. It could be hand in hand, as long as the 2 different things are 2 representational formats, okay? And that gives, or one of the things that give gesture its power. Okay, so, and it also, the bottom line is that gesture serves the same cognitive functions for signers as it does for speakers. Okay, so what I've shown you is that language is resilient. When it can't come out of the mouth, it comes out of the hands, and it reveals fundamental properties of mind that give shape to language. Gesture is also resilient. It comes for free along with language, speech or sign, and it often conveys ideas not found in language. And you don't even know those ideas are happening often. Okay, so one last thing. What our hands, in general, just to summarize, what our hands tell us about our minds that we don't see in language is, first of all, home sign tells us which linguistic structures humans can create on their own, okay, what they can do, what we give to communication, not the other way around. The emergence of sign language from home sign tells us about how learning a language, which is what all of us have done, how learning a language changes language. And finally, the gestures that accompany language, be it speech or sign, tells us how we learn, and more importantly, how we generalize the information that we've gotten. Because extending from the situation, the learning situation, is what we want to do as teachers. And what I want to do just before finishing is to try to summarize and talk about this data and these findings for teachers. I do think that the gestures that we produce and that children produce, the gesture can be useful in the classroom. And I think it can be useful in 3 different ways. First, we can use gestures to find out what students know. Students don't say everything they know. Some of the things they say with their hands. So if you're attentive as a teacher to what the children are gesturing, you're going to find out, in fact, it's the ideas that they have that are really on the cusp of their knowledge, the ideas they're really working with. That's useful information to find out what they're thinking at that moment and perhaps to teach to that. So you can use it as a diagnostic. We also have some evidence that that gesture can be used as a diagnostic for kids who are language delayed. That really using gesture can tell us about what cognitive state a child is in. Okay, and of course, you have to watch their gestures in order to do this. Gesture can also be used to awaken implicit ideas and introduce new ones. So I showed you an example where we told the kids how to gesture. We said, we do this and whatever. And that affected how they learned. We did another study where we just told the kids to gesture. We said, okay, the next time you solve this problem, I want you to gesture. And what we had originally thought is that, okay, you tell a kid to gesture, or you tell an adult to gesture, and those gestures will then match speech, because you're going to align them. Why would you make them different? It's not what happened. What happened, in fact, is that the children said exactly the same thing they said before, but they started gesturing new things. And a lot of those new things were correct. And then when we instructed them, they went even further and they learned from that instruction. So what this means at some level is that this can scale up. You don't have to know which gestures to teach your students in order for them to find it useful. Just tell them to gesture. It can't hurt, because it will produce these gestures that will be useful for you anyhow, and probably it will generate implicit ideas for them. It really can't hurt. So give it a try. And then the final thing is that you can teach below the radar. So I think teachers use gesture all the time. I have some examples that I didn't show you where the gestures that the teacher produces is just taking the kid off the rails, to the wrong example. So you sort of have to think about how you're gesturing and maybe introduce some ideas through your hands that you might not introduce through your mouth. We've found, in fact, that if a teacher says one thing and gestures another and they're complementary, it's really good for instruction. So just think about the gestures that you use when you teach kids. And don't be afraid to have your gestures do something different from your speech. Okay. So my bottom line here is that home sign and gesture provide what I would say is an unobstructed view. You can argue with that if you'd like. An unobstructed view onto the mind hidden in our hands and a tool for changing our minds. So what I want to do is end by thanking all of the millions of people who have helped me do these studies and thanking you for listening.
We have time for questions. Vous pouvez poser toutes les questions que vous voulez en français. Je vais relever le challenge d'essayer de les traduire en anglais. Et entre Suzanne et moi, on va y arriver. Donc n'hésitez pas. Ou vous pouvez gesturer vos questions. Quelques questions? Là. Attendez, il y a un micro qui va venir vers vous. Si on y arrive.
Thank you very much. It was very informative. I just have a question regarding the last studies that you've presented. And very naturally, I was just wondering whether you've tried this beneficial effect of mismatching in other subjects, like musical notation or...
Right, yeah. Other people have. They've tried to teach people music by using gesture. I don't think anybody's done this idea of mismatching gesture and speech. And in fact, we've only done it with respect to the math problem. But it's something that I think we really do need to replicate and extend. Because it's very intriguing. To be honest, we didn't predict that. We predicted that when you say one thing and you gesture another and you give it to a kid, the kid will go and it won't be able to learn anything. But in fact, they did much, much better. So I think we have to replicate it and then also extend it to these other domains because it's potentially really interesting. It's really interesting. Yeah, thanks.
Oui, là-bas. Là-bas, il y avait une demoiselle là-bas.
Thank you. I was just wondering how you define language in this context, and also if you could speak to whether you believe it's a uniquely human capacity or if non-human animals also can use language.
Right. It's a really good question. It's a very important question, particularly for the first part of my talk. What's language? It depends on who's answering the question. So what Heidi Feldman and Lila Gleitman and I did was we decided to look at deaf kids of hearing parents and in relation to what hearing kids learning spoken language from hearing parents do and what deaf kids learning sign language from deaf parents do. So we just basically mapped them onto each other and looked at the properties of language that you see here and see if we find it here. So in other words, we skirted the issue. We just didn't, I forgot to go to the last slide, okay. We didn't really address what is language. But it also matters a lot for the gesture question. Like, what are we calling gesture? And so what we've called, and this is really hard in sign language. In spoken language, it's not so hard. You talk and everybody considers that language, and then there's the gestures that come out of your hands. But for sign language, since they're both coming out of the hands, it's often very hard to distinguish gesture from sign language. And in fact, what signers often do is they put their gestures on top of their signs. So they modulate their signs with a gesture. They'll show you sort of how it's going up and not just that it's going up. We do it too when we're speaking, not with our hands, but with our prosody. You know, it's really boring. You know, we change our words. We haven't changed the words, but we've modulated it. So the gesture sign question gesture language question is there for sign language as well. Now, the last question you've asked, whether it's unique to humans, I do think it is unique to humans. You know, we've looked at chimpanzees and bonobos for a long time. They don't invent this stuff. And what they do, even when they're taught sign language, bonobos and chimpanzees or whatever, they will use their gestures to request things, you know, to come and play with me, to give me a banana, to run and chase me. They will never use their gestures to just say, "What a great day. I love my bananas. It's really, bananas are my favorite." They just don't use their gestures in the same way. Most of their gestures are very, very close to action. I think they can produce gestures, but they never string them together, and they don't use them in the same way. So I think it's really, one of the things we have to do, I think, is have people who study chimpanzees and bonobos look at gesture in exactly the same way that we look at gesture for hearing kids and for deaf kids, and show the similarities and the differences, because there are some similarities, but there are also differences. So, thank you for the question.
Yep.
Thank you. It's fascinating and very convincing, so I think you definitely passed with the highest grades the exam for,
thank you. That's good.
For your degree tomorrow.
Okay. Was I in some danger of losing it? Good, I didn't know.
No, I'm just wondering about individual differences. You definitely must have run into children that just did not sign, or even, you know, we have these stereotypes about cultures, like Italians without an arm that are speech impaired and that kind of thing.
Yep. I think that's a great question. Let me do the culture question first, and then we'll come back to individual differences. There's, you know, everybody believes that there are some cultures that gesture so much more than other cultures. I haven't done this work myself, but people who have looked at Northern Europe, everybody thinks, you know, they don't gesture. In Southern Europe, Italy, you know, gesture like crazy. It's actually not true. The rates are pretty much the same. I know, it's surprising. But what happens in Southern Europe is that people gesture big. You know, you're out there, so it's very visible when you're gesturing. And also, Southern Europe has more emblems, more of these kinds of things and things like that, and the road ones and whatever. Okay, so I'm not sure the cross-cultural differences are as big as we think they are. But individual differences, I think, are really interesting, and we've just studied that very, very little. We haven't looked at it enough. We are just beginning to pay attention to the fact that not all of the children we look at on these math problems gesture. All the children gesture for conservation, but not all for the math problems. Does that affect how they learn? I think it does. So what does it mean to not gesture? Now, I don't think there is anybody who just doesn't gesture. I think there are contexts in which you do or don't gesture. You can always make somebody gesture, but I think that's sort of our next step. We really have to look at what the individual differences are, because I think it can tell us something about how it's working, how gesture works. Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, we have one question there in the back, and then one here.
Oh.
Thank you. I had a question, about the graph you showed with correspondence between children and their mothers about like this complex sentence.
Yeah.
And I was a bit curious about, so you talk mostly from the side that the child would, learn from the mother or imitate, but what about the feedback they actually get from their mothers? In the sense
that's
that,
great question. Yeah. So, I mean, because there are two ways you can learn. You can learn from copying what the parents do, and that's what I've really talked about. But maybe the parents are more likely to reinforce and say yes, give them an apple when they point at the apple first and do this. So we've looked at this in a really simple way. And we haven't found good evidence for it. But I have a postdoc right now, Ruthie Fouché, who's really interested in this question. And so we're trying to go back to the tapes, the old original 1972 tapes, to look much more carefully at what the parents do and how they respond. And at the least, whether they're teaching the children to be good users of communication and more pragmatically proficient than otherwise. I'm not sure they're teaching them the structure, but I think they may be teaching them something. So that's our next avenue of research. Yeah, thanks for the question. That was good. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Actually, my question will not be exactly about what you just said, but more about the university represent. Well, tomorrow you're going to be honored by our rector president, who used to be economics professor. And University of Chicago is, of course, very famous
for economics.
For its modern.
We just got another Nobel Prize.
Exactly.
Did you see?
Exactly. A lot of them. Yeah. I mean, every few years you get an economics prize. But I mean, what's important, they have developed with Milton Friedman, right? It was almost 50 years ago. New theory, right, more monetary, and actually, it's not only economics; it's about behavior. It's I mean, there's a lot of psychology in it, right? Because I mean, it goes much further than what we say or think.
Yeah.
So I want to ask you: do you have any cooperation? I mean, do you speak to those people?
To the economics guys?
Yeah, to those guys. Yeah, and can you also? I mean, in your studies, maybe just about if you even don't work with them, but you certainly know what they do.
I do.
Can you use this in your psychology and human development studies, maybe parts of their work, so that it stays within the university?
That's a good question. We do work with some of the economics guys, usually on aspects of my work that I haven't talked about today, trying to instruct children and improve their learning. What the economics guys do is they have a big box and they don't really care much about what's happening when the learning is happening. And our team in psychology and education are trying to figure out what's going on there. Now, so it doesn't have much to do with gesture, but I bet if we looked at economists, economic professors in particular, if you look at them explaining what they do, they will gesture like crazy. Because physics professors do, and chemistry professors do, and geology professors do. Science seems to bring gesture out, even humanities and linguistics, but particularly in science. So maybe someday I'll get an economics professor to talk to me, and then I'll look at their gestures, and I'll let you know whether they mismatch or not.
Okay, we have time for one more quick question here.
Thank you for this incredible talk and also for your whole contribution on the field. I had, I guess, it's more a comment than a question, but I think it's really interesting, these mismatches. And I was wondering to what extent this could mirror what we find in supplementary speech gesture combination, as we know that this is adding, it's a label that contains more than the information present in the gesture. And so this is also an additional information as we have here in the mismatches with the numbers and equations.
So you're thinking of where speech adds information to the gesture. Exactly. That's an interesting, we've defined mismatch in the way that you've suggested, where gesture adds information to the speech. We haven't looked particularly at where speech adds information to the gesture, but I think it may happen in instances where there's a little bit more rote education. So moral reasoning, for example. The kids learn certain how to describe a moral event or a moral reasoning situation in speech. And what you see is the gestures aren't quite there. And so what I actually think in that situation is that the speech may not be attached to what they know. It may just be rote, and the gesture may be really where they are. But that is just in that moral reasoning situation. But I think it's a really good question. I mean, I think this mismatch is important to explore. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, and as you mentioned that and found that it was predicting then learning or helping learning, as we know that you also showed that supplementary gesture combination might be helpful then in predicting grammatical structures. I think it's really interesting to see this parallelism between the two.
I'm very intrigued by this, and I'm really intrigued by the fact that it works as a teaching tool, because that is just not what I would have predicted. So I want to find out whether that's, how true that is, whether it extends. Yeah, thanks.
I can see there's one question just behind you. Yeah, go ahead, and then we'll...
Thank you very much. I just made a small experience while you were talking.
Yeah.
I was looking at your gestures.
Right. I know.
And then I forced myself not to hear what you say.
Yeah.
Looking again at the gestures. And then try to listen to what you say without looking at the gestures.
Okay. And the results are?
I should be pretty good in learning because I didn't see any matching. And it didn't help me at all, one way or the other. So I'm looking forward to learn. Could you comment on this? Thank you.
This mismatching stuff has to be simultaneous. We've actually done a study where we tried to pull apart the speech and the gesture. So we gave the kids speech and gesture together in the instruction, or we gave them, we told them to do speech and then to gesture. And we actually thought that separating it might be better because it's clearer, the gestures are clearer. And when they're put together, it all comes at you at once. The results were really clear. When it all comes at you at once, it's much better. So the simultaneity of it is important. So it wasn't a perfect study to find out whether a mismatch works, but it was a really informative study. Right. Gesture needs speech. You can't just gesture. It won't make it. Right. But if you just speak and ignore, if you just listen on the phone and you don't see people move their hands, you will miss things that they are saying. Not always, but you will at times. You can't just look at gesture and figure out what somebody's saying. It's not, you can for home sign. You really can for home sign, and that's really what makes it really clear that home sign is not just gesture. But speech is not a perfect system, so there are things that are difficult to express, either for you at that moment or in language, and that's where gesture comes in. That's where it's really useful.
There's a question right there.
Yes,
go ahead.
Thank you very much for this fascinating talk. I just wanted to ask you a question about bilingualism and gestures.
Yeah.
Because as you know, it's been claimed to boost the use of gestures, and I was wondering what you thought would be the underlying reason for that.
Well, people say it's because you're having trouble expressing, and so you bring out your gestures, and it's a little unclear whether it increases the gesture or not. It might in some people. One of the things that's very interesting to look at is whether the gestures match your first language or your second language, because gesture isn't identical. The gestures that accompany speech are influenced by the speech structurally. So let me give you a quick example. In English, we say you roll down the hill, and the gesture that we do is roll down the hill. The rolling and the down are the same one gesture. In Turkish, you say you go down the hill by rolling. Two separate clauses, and the way they gesture is they go, I didn't do that right, but they go down the hill by rolling. So they're two different systems, okay? So when you're becoming a bilingual in a second language, are you using your first language's gestures, or have you moved on to use your second language gestures? I think that's a really interesting way to think about it, because I bet that if you're moving on to your second language and you're still using your first language gestures, you may be a little stuck. More stuck than somebody who's using the second language gestures. So in addition to amount, I think we can look at type and look at it in relation to the language. But that's not been done very much yet.
Okay, we have a last question way at the back.
Je veux augmenter la difficulté en posant ma question en français. Est-ce qu'on peut admettre, dans le cadre de vos travaux, que les mains et les doigts sont le reflet de la réflexivité? Et qu'en est-il lorsque nous sommes en dialogue interne, c'est-à-dire en pensant des micro-gestes que nous pouvons faire?
You're going to have to translate that.
Can we admit that when we use gestures, this is actually reflect is actually an expression of reflexivity, like of like being thinking about ourselves, I think, if I understood well. And then when we actually think by ourselves and when we have these micro gestures, are these again part of the same process of reflecting upon oneself?
Upon oneself. You mean so gesturing when you're sort of talking to yourself? Is that sort of what you mean?
Est-ce que vous voulez dire, est-ce que ouais, je peux traduire aussi, je sais pas si vous avez la traduction, c'est bon? Non. Alors, est-ce que vous voulez dire utiliser des gestures pour se parler à soi-même? En fait, qu'est-ce que vous voulez dire? Comment je traduis réflexivité? Parce que réflexivité, ça peut vouloir dire beaucoup de choses. Donc, je ne suis pas exactement sûre du mot réflexivité. Si vous me dites plus sur réflexivité, j'arriverai à savoir comment il faut que je passe en anglais.
Donc, on parle d'un dialogue interne, c'est-à-dire on est vraiment avec des pensées. Alors, on n'est pas en train de communiquer à l'autre, on est simplement dans un dialogue interne.
So talking to oneself.
Yes. Okay. Okay. So I have a feeling that when you're talking to yourself, you're really talking internally, and you're gesturing along with those internal thoughts. I mean, there's no good way of proving that. Although we could think about how to prove it. But I think those gestures are... I used to watch my father sitting there driving the car and clearly talking to himself, and he's gesturing with his hands, not talking to me. So I think those gestures actually are reflecting his thinking that are going along with thought. But there may be gestures that are... So those are sort of co-thought gestures, but there may be other gestures that are just out there. If I look at a picture and I try to represent it without talking to myself, those may be qualitatively different gestures. So I think those are great questions, and we just need to explore the conditions under which they arise.
Okay, with this, I'd like us to thank Susan and all of you for being here tonight.